Hello, welcome to beautiful Mount Holly Cemetery in downtown Little Rock. I'm Ashley Sides, and in today's Sandwiching in History tour, we're going to find out what makes this place so special. Turns out, it's a lot of things. Let's go inside. Mount Holly Cemetery was established in 1843 and is still being used. It was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1970 with the national level of significance. With its garden-like appearance, Mount Holly Cemetery is an excellent example of a Victorian-era cemetery. So many notable people were buried here. The Mount Holly is often called the Westminster Abbey of Arkansas. To take a stroll through Mount Holly Cemetery is like walking through the very history of Little Rock, even Arkansas itself. The Mount Holly Cemetery didn't achieve its historic merits overnight. To understand more about the background of this beloved cemetery, I turned to someone who's been giving tours here for over 20 years, and she takes us back to a time when Little Rock was simply a village on the banks of the Arkansas River.
My name is Matilda Buchanan, and I am a board member on the Mount Holly Cemetery Board. Mount Holly is now located in the center of Little Rock, really on the eastern edge of Little Rock, and we're on the south end of downtown. But in 1843, when Mount Holly was founded, we were a cow pasture outside of the city of Little Rock. In the 17th and 18th centuries, burial grounds were associated with a particular church. So you had the burial ground around the church. But as we became a republic and as we had westward expansions, cities decided that they should be responsible for the burial of their citizens, not so much for altruism, but for public health, because you didn't want grandma just buried next to the back steps where the well was. So there were city cemeteries, and with a city cemetery, anybody is welcome as long as they buy the lot. The city of Little Rock had another burial ground down at Capitol Avenue today between State and Gaines, but in 1839 the city decided that they had outgrown that space, so they asked two prominent Little Rockians, Chester Ashley and Roswell Beebe, to donate part of their cow pasture. So that is what is now Mount Holly. It's a 4 square block oasis in the middle of a very busy part of Little Rock. You will notice when we walk around Mount Holly that we are a wonderful preservation of 19th century funerary art. And just about any style from the 19th century through the 20th century is available here at Mount Holly. A flame, that's eternal life. We've got angels pointing to heaven. You've got a plain obelisk. The 19th century Victorians borrowed a lot of Egyptian motifs for their symbolism. We have a cross here with ivy growing around it. Ivy is a symbol of eternal life, mainly because you can never get rid of it. It comes back no matter what. Again, over this obelisk, you have lilies, a symbol of the resurrection, going around. So the iconography of Mount Holly is unending. You could study for years out here, looking into the importance of these symbols to the 19th century Americans. The 1898 Bell House. It was, of course, 50 years after the opening of the cemetery. But by that time, Mount Holly was booming, both with residents here in Mount Holly and as a place for the elite of Little Rock to be buried. It's in the steamboat Gothic style. We have recently repaired it and restored it to the way it looked in 1898. Over the years, a lot of the gingerbread detail had fallen away and it had been repaired with just whatever. But we found some early photographs, and because we're in historic preservation. Anytime we do a repair, we have to take it back to the original. So we wrote lots of grants for this because we didn't have the funds to do it ourselves. So it has a cedar shake roof, and you can see all the wonderful detail. There is a bell in the bell tower, and in the 19th century, when it was time for people to gather for a funeral, someone would ring the bell and the sexton would be called. In the 19th century, most people were full burials in the ground, but some people, some wealthy families, wanted their own space. So this is a private mausoleum just for the family. When it was built in 1910, it cost $10,000 to build that. And it was designed by George Gibb, one of the architects of the Arkansas Capitol. Okay, we're now at the north end of the cemetery, and the building behind me is the city mausoleum. By the second decade of the 20th century, Mount Holly was pretty well populated. And as I said earlier, some people like to be buried in the ground, but some people don't. And if your family could not afford to have a private mausoleum, they needed to create a public mausoleum. This is known as the city mausoleum. It is a city building, but the spaces inside are sold to individuals. So it's much like the cemetery itself. This was built in 1919. See, it's in the beautiful Art Deco style, designed by Charles Thompson, the noted 19th century architect who designed many of the private homes here in the Quapaw Quarter. There's Tiffany stained glass inside. The interior is marble. These are private chapels that are owned by families. These are called drawers because they work just like a drawer. Of course, they are cemented in, but if you needed to go in to put somebody, you chisel out the drawer and take the heavy marble plate down, and then you put the caskets in there, and then you cement them in there.
No description of Mount Holly Cemetery would be complete without mention of some of the famous people that are buried here. A lot of the names that often get mentioned are those of men, and you'll recognize them from your history books. There's Chester Ashley, Augustus Garland, William Woodruff, the Conway family, on and on and on. But women made our history and shaped our society too, and Mount Holly tells their stories as well. Without the lifetime contributions of the ladies that are buried here, our society would be lacking in so many of the civic, philanthropic, educational, charitable, and healthcare organizations and institutions that we benefit from today. So today we're going to highlight two of the notable women whose memories live on here at Mount Holly, Kweki Ross and Dolphine Fletcher Terry.
Albert Pike was a good friend of John Ross, who was the chief of the Cherokee tribe. When the Indian Removal Act took effect, affecting the Cherokees in 1830, John Ross lived in Georgia. He was extraordinarily wealthy. He wanted to take care of his people. He had fought for 20 years to stop the Indian removal. And all that time, Pike had been a good friend of his. So when the inevitable happened, John Ross hired a steamboat to move his family by river up, coming through Little Rock, Arkansas, to go on up the Arkansas River to Oklahoma. So, February 1839, the Victoria is the name of the steamboat, is between Pine Bluff and Little Rock. And on board is, John's not on board, he'd gone ahead. On board is his wife Elizabeth. Her nickname was Kweki, Q-U-A-T-I-E, Kweki Ross. And she died. We're not sure of what, whether it was pneumonia or dysentery, or anyway, she died. And was buried in the burial ground, the original burial ground of the city of Little Rock. Remember, this is before Mount Holly. When Mount Holly opened in 1843, the graves from the original burial ground were moved here to Mount Holly. So today, when you go around Mount Holly, you'll find markers that predate 1843. That means they were moved from the original burial ground. So, we think that Kweki was moved and buried here on Albert Pike's grave. There was no marker for a long time. A group of women involved in historic preservation, they decided in 1935 to put up a marker here commemorating Kweki Ross. In 1996, when we were redoing the sexton's house, we dug up a lot of infill and we found this half of a tombstone. Now this is a replica, and I'll talk to you about the replica. But this half from this crack over was found, which indicates that we think that it was the original tombstone that was moved from 5th and Gaines here when Kweki Elizabeth Ross was reinterred, and that sometime over the preceding years it fell and it was cracked and was just used as infill. We called in Historic Arkansas Museum, and they took the original down to their labs and they extrapolated what they thought would have been on the other side and created this replica for us. The original is still at Historic Arkansas Museum. In 1891, now we're talking 60 years after Kweki died, no, maybe not 60, maybe 50 years after she died, an old Army veteran who had left the Army before she died wrote a story and had it published in the press. And his story said that he had been part of the federal government troops who escorted the Indians up through Arkansas, and that one cold February, an Indian princess, Kweki Ross, noticed that a baby was sick. And so she gave this sick baby her blanket and saved the baby's life, but Kweki died as a result of it. And this story caught fire in the press. And it became so symbolic, this myth, that it galvanized the press, it galvanized the Native Americans in Oklahoma. Girls who were studying at the Indian schools wrote poems about it. It became so important to the spirit of his people. And they suffered terrible deprivation, not just physical deprivation, but monetary deprivation. They lost their homes, they lost everything to the unfair law of the United States government. But it became more real than the truth. There is something powerful about the marriage of history, facts, and myths, and how it speaks to our soul as a people. way. I see it as a way that history and myth can come, the study of history and the valuing of myth can come together to show why we feel the way we feel and why we remember things the way we remember them. So this is the story of Kweki.
Moving from the 19th century to the 20th, we meet Audrey Terry, who was a force to be reckoned with for education and social change.
Audrey Terry was a very important figure in women's rights in the 20th century in Arkansas. She advocated for the women's right to vote in 1920. She helped establish schools. Terry Elementary School was named for her. During the 1957 crisis, she was part of the Women's Emergency Committee that advocated to reopen the schools because the schools had been closed by the segregationists. I met Mrs. Terry when I was a young girl. My grandmother took me to meet her. She was then living in the Pike Terry Mansion, which Albert Pike built. That, as I told you, is the antebellum mansion down on 8th Street. And she was this little white-haired lady sitting back in her back sunroom that was filled with bird cages because her daughter Mary collected birds. And I sat and visited with her. And at the time, I didn't know how special it was that I was getting to meet Audrey Terry. But she too is buried here in Mount Holly. Cemeteries, while they are the home of the dead, they are really for the living. They function as a way for families to remember the people that they've lost. It's a focal point. You come and you see a name and a date engraved and you remember that person. Then your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren can still come and find the place where their ancestor was memorialized. Cemeteries are also a living history location, because when you come to a cemetery, an old cemetery like Mount Holly, and you're told the stories of the people who created the cemetery and who lived here or who died in a foreign war and were brought back here, history comes alive for you. So it is a place where the present and the past meet, and then it is transferred inside of somebody, particularly a young child, and then it is transmitted to the future. So that's why cemeteries are important.
If you've never thought of a cemetery as a place to visit just for the sake of it, Mount Holly is a cemetery to change your mind. It's a garden with plenty of shade and benches. It's a place for a picnic, for reflection, for a leisurely stroll through history. It's a place to meet with the memories of those who have made Little Rock and Arkansas what it is today. Next month, we'll hop across the river to the North Bank and visit the Argenta Historic District of downtown North Little Rock. We hope you'll join us.